but historical inaccuracy is still taught often. Also that the US and South Vietnam lost. Technically they did not. That war ended in January of 1973 with a peace treaty in which North Vietnam agreed to the continued partition, and to not attack the South anymore. The North broke that treaty in Jan of 1974, about a year later, and started a brand new war, which they won. The US did not get involved in that war. This one is actually a common one. England's King Ethelred was not nicknamed Ethelred the Unready because he wasn't ready for a Viking attack. His nickname was Ethelred Unnard. Unnard translates to ill-advised, while his name means well-advised. Nice one. It was mistranslated by some historians and stuck around. Reading his parts of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is really funny for just this reason, because the writers, monks, absolutely hated the decisions he'd made, but didn't want to criticize the king himself. So every year as entry goes, 1010, in this year, the Danes, that is any Vikings, they didn't stop to ask place of origin, set fire to half of Northumbria and killed my brother James, after aping everyone in his family. The Baron Alfred tried to fight them off, assisted by 7 senile donkeys armed to the teeth with blades of grass, but alas, he died. The king, following some absolutely cracking advice, gave the invaders a diamond-encrusted butt plug in his daughter's hand in marriage as compensation. The abbot Elfric was consecrated as a bishop. Yes, I live in New Zealand and I heard this a lot during the centenary period. A quick Google shows the percentage casualties of World War I based on population, lowest and highest estimates due to unclear causality numbers, as 1.6% to 1.7% for New Zealand. For others, the UK was 1.9% to 2.2%, France was 4.3% to 4.4%, Germany was 3.4% to 4.3%, Italy 3% to 3.5%, etc. Serbia's 16.7%, TP 27.8%, so I don't know why that fact keeps getting told. I'd like to add the teaching that George Washington is the first U.S. president. This is somewhat true but it's incomplete. George Washington is the first U.S. president under the Constitution. Someone can crunch the numbers and figure out if we declared our independence in 1776, then how did George Washington's term start in 1789? The U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1788. It replaced the Articles of Confederation in 1789, which is what the U.S. was actually founded on. Hence the name Confederate States of America when the South seceded during the Civil War. The Articles were created in 1777 and passed in 1781, which created the Continental Congress. Under the Articles, we really didn't have a president we think of today, but we had President of the Continental Congress who was more like a presiding officer, and we had 10 such presidents starting with Samuel Huntington from March to July, 1781 and ending with Cyrus Griffin from January to November, 1788. The Articles of Confederation failed where the U.S. had a structure similar to the EU as opposed to an actual country, hence the name, Confederation, that is a union of states as opposed to a country made of states. The loose federal power and the relatively strong state power almost destroyed this country, and Shays' Rebellion crystallized the failures of the weak state where a stronger federal government can keep the country together. This is also why the CSA split, because they wanted to return the power to the states so they can have slavery. I really think that people need to learn about the very early founding of our country and read the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers, since these arguments, about strong versus weak federal government compared to the states, continues today and is embodied in the various arguments by both political parties. Another fun fact is that the one of the Allies, the Tlaxcalans, were so loyal to Spain that the Spanish left them alone while they continued to colonize the rest of Mexico. The Spanish crown protected their rights to remain independent, and they were even seen as superior to other indigenous groups. It's even more amazing that the Spanish never reneged on this deal throughout their entire presence there until Mexico became independent. Yep, Columbus's actual big innovation was that he believed the circumference of the Earth was smaller than was generally believed at the time. It turned out that he was absolutely wrong about that, but luckily for him he ran into a whole unexpected continent that was sitting right in the middle of his route, because otherwise his miscalculation would have meant he was super screwed. This is why American workers are absolutely bombarded with anti-union propaganda. By our nature we dislike authority, and as a nation we're armed to the teeth. For decades American workers fought bloody battles for a 40-hour work week, for a weekend, for a safe work environment, and against child labor. The Battle of Blair Mountain. Over 1 million rounds were fired in a battle with workers who'd been fed up with 14-hour days in coal mines and living in tents and being brutalized by private investigators. Thugs hired the capitalists. Lots of good music came from it too. The IWW, Communist Party, Socialist Party, and so on feature heavily here. The National Guard was called in by the capitalists, who shot or imprisoned anyone who didn't immediately get back in the mines. So many. The Titanic disaster has rooted itself firmly in pop culture as one of those things we think we know the general story of, but the history is quite different. Titanic wasn't speeding. The fourth funnel wasn't fake or a dummy. It just served a different purpose than the other three. It was not purely aesthetic. Titanic didn't go out with 2 little lifeboats. By 1912 standards, she actually had more than she was legally required to take, and was designed to take many more. The idea they were so sure of her reliability they cut on safety is very false. Also, no one ended up dying due to lack of boats, but lack of time. Titanic sank before she could launch all 20. While yes, it was inevitable that people would die due to lack of boats, they hadn't reached that point by the final moments. The idea of people trapped on board waiting to die with no way off isn't quite true. They were still trying to launch them within the last 5 minutes. Third class were not purposefully locked below, and certainly not because of classism. This one requires a bit of a lengthy response, but the short version is, it seemed to be all simply a matter of confusion and or miscommunication. There was no active attempt to hold back passengers according to ticket. In fact, it was the exact opposite. There was no 300-foot gash. The damage was made along roughly 300 feet, but it was a series of incredibly small indents and holes. Lack of binoculars. There was no such thing as no binoculars. They had plenty. I think we have 3 sets from the wreck alone. While it's true that a last-minute staffing change didn't give the Crow's Nest access to a pair, it's incredibly important to understand it didn't matter much. Binoculars were not favored especially high, and were not required. The closest thing we can get to blaming them is testimony that states that binoculars maybe would have been just enough to avoid the collision. Maybe, but certainly not for sure. Titanic was almost on top of the iceberg by the time it was sighted. Binoculars would have done nothing to see it earlier. A reading of the testimony shows us wishful thinking and hypothesized hindsight, not blame or condemnation. All of those are centered around the theme that Titanic was the victim of hubris. The history, however, shows that that narrative is a consequence of post-tragedy press and not reality. Titanic was an incredibly safe and advanced ship with some absolutely horrible luck. It's easy to nitpick to try and find reasons why, but the reality is Titanic was very safe on a normal, boring, albeit famous, and over-cautionary sailing. I've tried to hit some of the bigger, famous ones here. The more nerdy you get and down the rabbit hole you go, the more there is to unpack. Smile. There's definitely this thought process that normal Germans, and Poles, Austrians, Hungarians, etc., didn't know about the comps at all during the Holocaust. That gets pushed as fact in schools, which is bullshit. The concept of the goings-on at AKZ was absolutely something people knew. When my grandfather was growing up, it was normal to hire people from Dachau satellite camps to build fences or work in fields or whatever. The industrialization process and scale of it was news to them, for sure. But if something happened to you and you were sent to AKZ, everyone knew it was a death sentence, and you were going to be forced into labor until you died. By the time 1944 rolled around, they were pretty aware of the gas chambers too, though most people didn't believe it. Definitely. The biggest camps were in Poland, but the locals there knew about them. The guards did try to hide what was happening at them, but it's hard to not figure out after a while when the locals saw trains full of prisoners kept going to these places which could not possibly hold them all. Also, the prisoners were, as you said, often forced to work outside the camp and would be seen being marched to and from the camp every day. Auschwitz, where my grandfather was right next to a small town, and the prisoners walked through it to work all the time. They would have been obviously starving. There is a part in Anne Frank's diary where she says she heard on the radio that Jews were being gassed to death. Allied planes even flew over the camps and took photos of the crematoria. So it was like you said, the scale of it wasn't known, but it was clear what was going on there. And on top of that, quite a lot of Holocaust victims weren't killed in the camps. Many were killed in mass shootings which were done out in the open. So even if most of the killings weren't done in Germany itself, word would have to get around sooner or later. However, especially in American classrooms, we hear that battles were set with agreed-upon locations and times. Very, very rare. We hear that the birds fought in straight lines only because it was the gentlemanly way, and not, say, the easiest way to order, maneuver and direct a horde of armed, drunken murderers. That American Minutemen won because we didn't engage in their old-fashioned ways by hiding behind rocks and trees, which works a treat as long as everyone remains within shouting distance of the one guy in charge, and also if the enemy doesn't have cavalry, because if they do, are fucked. Shit like that. We are raised to believe that wars were fought in certain ways because it was traditional and backwards, not because controlling an army is extremely difficult and pre-modern /trench linear pike and shot medieval ancient warfare methods were dumb and stupid even for their day. Ancient generals and leaders on the whole weren't stupid, but merely making the best with what they had. Pike formations crawling slowly across battlefields seems silly until you consider what terrible things happen to infantry caught in the open by cavalry. Lining ships up side by side for broadside seems dumb until you realize that it's actually a hard tactic to beat until you can make ironclad warships with turrets for less money than exists in all the world. Having soldiers dress in bright uniforms that offer no camouflage seems idiotic until you realize that being able to recognize friends is much more important than hiding from the enemy in this era before long-range communication and easy access to officers that could think, walk and listen all at the same time. I don't think it's tout, but the general Americans seem to believe that cowboys were mostly white people, when in actuality it was Mexicans and even black people after they were freed. It was considered a lowly position in the Wild West. If a cowboy was white, he was a very poor white. White people were on the frontier farming and such. Asians, the Chinese, did laundry and were cooks. That's where a lot of Chinese American foods originated from. People also seem to forget that this time period, which was maybe only 30-50 years, had three pinnacle events unfold in U.S. history. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed, the Chinese Exclusion Act went into law, and slavery was abolished. I may be wrong, but I believe in that order too. Transcontinental Railroad was completed, the Chinese Exclusion Act went into law, and slavery was abolished. I may be wrong, but I believe in that order too. The order was actually slavery abolished, 1865, then the first Transcontinental Railroad was completed, 1869, and then there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882. But the lead-up, enforcement, and repercussions of these events extended before and after the hard, official dates. Edit, by the way, /u/Asian Hawk, your response was great. Here's a Smithsonian article: Black Cowboys. I would add the complexity of the Civil War and what it did to the food supply. Beef would never have been so popular in the U.S. had two things not happened. The war took place mostly in the eastern parts of the U.S., so the food supply in that part of the country was decimated. The absence of fighting men from the West allowed the cattle to mate and graze freely, causing an explosion in population that they realized upon returning. Thus the cattle drive to the major population centers was born, since refrigeration hadn't been invented yet. that William Wallace was a poor uneducated farmer that grew up in some small village and not a literal nobleman, and that Robert the Bruce betrayed him. CTBH, a lot of Braveheart is complete Hollywood bullshit, which is sad since we don't get taught much of our own history in Scotland. My only memory of studying it in school was literally being made to watch that stupid movie and take notes. Braveheart is complete Hollywood trash. My favorite quote from the Wikipedia page. Sharon Cross noted that the film contains numerous historical inaccuracies, beginning with the wearing of belted plaid by Wallace and his men. In that period no Scots wore belted plaids, let alone kilts of any kind. Moreover, when Highlanders finally did begin wearing the belted plaid, it was not in the rather bizarre style depicted in the film. She compares the inaccuracy to a film about colonial America showing the colonial men wearing 20th century business suits, but with the jackets worn back to front instead of the right way around. Men have not always had the enforced right to vote. At the time of the American Revolution, it was given to white, male property owners, about 6% of the population. 150,000 people. A century later, all men were given it, but, of course, it wasn't enforced for male minorities. In 1919, women got it, but same deal with female minorities. With the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, everyone was, supposedly, given the right to vote. However, this is still not true of all men today. In some states, selective service registration is still a prerequisite. Thus, if you're a man, you still don't necessarily have the right to vote in America. It may actually be a privilege for you. Doctor, all women have had the enforced right to vote for 56 years this year. There has not been one point where all men have. In Egypt, people are taught that Egypt won the Yom Kippur War, and that Egypt got Sinai after militarily wresting it away from Israeli control. Usually war recounts and reenactments focus on the first day, when Egypt really did defeat Israel in combat and made it all the way to Gaza, but it conveniently ignores what happened in the following 2 days of the war, how Israel retaliated, or the real reasons why the war ended and Camp David agreement ended up the way it is. I guess you could technically see it as an Egyptian victory since the goal was to get Sinai in the first place, but it's more of a strategic, political victory, and certainly wasn't a military one. Ask Historians can teach you a lot more about these, but one thing that seems to be kind of implicitly taught is that since medieval Europeans were white, therefore they never saw or interacted with anyone who wasn't. I'm not saying there were a lot of people of color in Europe at the time, there weren't, but Europeans did travel to other continents and had contact with Africans and Asians going back to the classical era and before. Also foreigners did travel to Europe sometimes, and there were the Romani people, who are from India, living all over Europe. The Mongols invaded Europe in the 13th century or so, and the Arabs once colonized Spain. So a work about the Vikings or something that has a few people of color in it wouldn't necessarily be inaccurate. Corsets aren't meant to be painful, and tight lacing was only practiced by a few people. Corsets originated as stays or a pair of bodies, sometimes bodice, though that word is used for other types of tops as well. They were originally basically like wearing a camisole with a built-in bra. They were made of stiff canvas and has baleen, whale teeth, used to give them shape. I haven't worn any with whale teeth, but I have worn some with the plastic alternative that is said to be very close to the baleen. If they're made correctly, they are snug but not tight. Your body heat will actually slightly melt the baleen or plastic into place, and if you don't gain or lose too much weight, they become like memory foam after a while. The reason we think of corsets and tight lacing is because a few women did it in the late Victorian and early Edwardian eras, late 1800s, early 1900s. But for most of the time that corsets were popular, the goal wasn't to have a tiny waist, it was to have an hourglass figure. So you just padded out your bust and hips and bam. There were some women, and men, who hurt themselves achieving some impossible idea of beauty, but a good modern equivalent would be, most women aren't out here trying to look like Kim Kardashian. If they are, then most of them are using non-invasive ways to look like her, like makeup, hair dye, clothing. Some women are getting plastic surgery to look like her, butt implants, etc. But the women getting surgery to look like her are the minority.